The glint of the merciless Nevada sun against the broken wheel axle told Katherine Alvarez everything she needed to know. She wasn't reaching Carson City by nightfall. Not on this stagecoach. Not today. Possibly not ever if the circling vultures overhead had any say in the matter. The year was 1868, and Katherine's journey west had abruptly halted in the unforgiving desert between Silver Springs and Carson City. The other passengers, a banker and his wife, and an elderly gentleman had secured passage on a passing freight wagon hours ago, but Katherine had stubbornly refused to abandon her trunks. Everything she owned was packed inside those crates, and the freight wagon had no space for excess baggage. The stagecoach driver and shotgun guard had promised to send help from the next station. But as the sun climbed higher, Katherine's confidence in their return wilted like desert sage in August. "Damn it all," she muttered, dabbing at the perspiration beading along her hairline with a handkerchief that had long ago lost its crispness. Her dark chestnut hair, once neatly pinned beneath her bonnet, now stuck to her neck in damp tendrils. The expensive traveling dress she'd purchased in San Francisco, the one meant to make a proper impression upon her arrival, was stained with dust and sweat. She squinted at the horizon, watching heat waves dance across the barren landscape. Nothing moved except those ominous black birds overhead. Katherine had exactly 3 options. Wait for help that might never arrive, start walking in punishing heat without knowing precisely which direction to take, or prepare to spend a night alone in the desert with whatever creatures called this wasteland home. A sound caught her attention, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats growing louder. Katherine spun around, shielding her eyes against the sun's glare. A lone rider approached from the east, his silhouette gradually taking shape through the heat distortion. As he drew closer, she could make out a broad-shouldered man atop a chestnut stallion. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see that his clothes carried the dust and wear of someone who lived in the saddle. The stranger slowed his horse to a walk as he approached the disabled stagecoach. Katherine straightened her posture and adjusted her bonnet, suddenly aware of how disheveled she must look. She was alone in the desert with a man she'd never met, a potentially dangerous situation, but her immediate need for assistance outweighed caution. "Looks like you've had better days, madam," the rider called out as he reined his horse to a stop several yards from where she stood. "The axle broke 3 hours ago," Katherine replied, gesturing toward the stagecoach's damaged wheel. "The driver and guard went ahead to the station. They're supposed to be sending help." The man swung down from his saddle with easy grace and approached, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. His face was tanned and weathered by sun and wind, with lines at the corners of eyes that were the startling blue of a mountain lake. He wasn't classically handsome. His nose had clearly been broken at least once, and a thin scar cut through his right eyebrow, but there was something compelling about his features. Katherine guessed him to be in his early 30s. "Kyle Hawkins," he said by way of introduction. "I ride for the Silver Dollar Ranch about 20 miles north of here." "Katherine Alvarez," she replied, offering a gloved hand which he shook briefly. "I was on my way to Carson City." Kyle circled the stagecoach, examining the broken axle with a practiced eye. "This is beyond field repair, madam. Even if help comes, they'll need to bring a replacement coach or a wagon large enough for your trunks." He glanced at the sky. "And they'd better hurry. Storms brewing to the west." Katherine followed his gaze. Indeed, dark clouds were gathering along the distant mountains, a sight that seemed impossible given the current heat. "Desert weather," Kyle said, reading her expression. "Sunshine 1 minute, flash floods the next." He studied her for a moment, then seemed to reach a decision. "I'm headed to Carson City myself. I can get you there safely before that storm hits." "On your horse?" Katherine asked skeptically, eyeing the stallion. "Ajax can carry us both. We'd need to leave your trunks, though. I can arrange to have them collected tomorrow." Leave her trunks. The idea was preposterous. Those trunks contained everything she owned: clothes, books, heirlooms, and most importantly, the teaching contracts and school supplies for her new position. She couldn't simply abandon them in the desert. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Hawkins, but I couldn't possibly—" A distant rumble of thunder cut off her protest. The storm clouds had moved closer with alarming speed. "Miss Alvarez," Kyle said, his tone gentle but firm, "I don't mean to frighten you, but that's a flash flood warning if I ever saw one. These washes can fill in minutes. If we don't leave now, we could be stranded here overnight at best. At worst." He left the sentence unfinished. Katherine looked from her trunks to the approaching clouds, then back to Kyle's face. She was accustomed to making difficult decisions. It was why she'd left Philadelphia in the first place, but this one seemed impossible. Stay with her possessions and risk her life, or trust a stranger and abandon everything she owned. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I'll personally see to the recovery of your belongings," Kyle added, "but we need to decide now." Another clap of thunder, closer this time. The air had changed, becoming electric with the promise of rain. "Very well," Katherine conceded, "but I need one moment." She quickly opened her smallest trunk and retrieved a leather satchel containing her money, teaching certificates, and a miniature portrait of her parents, the irreplaceable items. She also grabbed a shawl, knowing desert nights could be bitterly cold. Kyle helped her secure the trunks as best they could, tying them down with leather straps from his saddlebags. Then he led her to his horse. "I'll mount first, then help you up behind me," he explained. Katherine hesitated. Riding double with a strange man was scandalously improper. Then again, so was dying in a desert flash flood. Once Kyle was in the saddle, he extended his arm down to her. With as much dignity as she could muster, Katherine grasped his forearm and felt herself lifted effortlessly up behind him. "You'll need to hold on to me," Kyle instructed. "It's going to be a fast ride." Reluctantly, Katherine placed her hands lightly on his sides. Kyle clicked his tongue, and Ajax broke into a ground-eating lope. The sudden movement forced Katherine to tighten her grip, bringing her uncomfortably close to Kyle's back. She could feel the solid muscle beneath his shirt, smell the leather and wood smoke scent of him. They'd gone perhaps a mile when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Within minutes, the sprinkle became a deluge. The temperature dropped dramatically as cold rain soaked through Katherine's clothes. She found herself pressed against Kyle's back, grateful for the meager shelter his body provided against the stinging rain. "Not much farther to shelter," he called over his shoulder, urging Ajax to a faster pace. Through the curtain of rain, Katherine could make out a small structure ahead, a lined shack or hunter's cabin of some sort. Kyle guided Ajax directly to the door, dismounted in one fluid movement, then helped Katherine down. Her legs trembled from the unaccustomed riding position, and she stumbled as her feet touched ground. Kyle caught her elbow, steadying her. "Inside, quickly," he urged, leading Ajax to a lean-to attached to the cabin. The cabin's interior was spare but dry, a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table and chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. Katherine stood dripping on the packed dirt floor, suddenly aware of how thoroughly drenched she was. Her traveling dress clung to her in a most unseemly manner, and her bonnet had collapsed under the weight of the rain. Kyle entered a moment later, equally soaked but carrying his saddlebags and a bundle of firewood from the lean-to. "You're shivering," he observed, dropping to his knees before the fireplace. "Let me get a fire going." Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, teeth chattering. Outside, the rain continued its assault, drumming against the wooden roof and turning the desert floor into muddy rivers. Kyle worked efficiently, arranging kindling and striking a match. Within minutes, flames licked at the logs, casting a warm glow throughout the small space. "There are dry clothes in that trunk," Kyle said, nodding toward a wooden chest in the corner. "Old things kept here for emergencies. They'll be too big, but they're dry." "I couldn't possibly, Miss Alvarez," Kyle interrupted gently. "If you stay in those wet clothes, you'll catch pneumonia. I'll step outside to check on Ajax while you change." Before she could protest further, he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Katherine stood irresolute for a moment, propriety warring with common sense. Finally, practicality won. She opened the trunk and found several flannel shirts, woolen trousers, and a knitted sweater. All men's clothing, all far too large, but all gloriously dry. She peeled off her sodden dress, petticoats, and corset, hanging them near the fire to dry. Clad in an oversized shirt and the sweater which hung nearly to her knees, she felt both ridiculous and immensely relieved. A knock at the door preceded Kyle's voice. "Are you decent, madam?" "Yes, though I use the term loosely," Katherine replied, tugging self-consciously at the shirt's collar. Kyle entered, carrying a damp blanket. "It got wet, but it'll dry quick by the fire." He'd removed his own soaked coat and rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing muscular forearms tanned by the sun. Water still dripped from his dark hair, which curled slightly when wet. "How long will the storm last?" Katherine asked, watching him hang the blanket near the fire. "Hard to say. Could blow over in an hour. Could last till morning." He rummaged through the cabin's supplies, producing a tin of coffee and some jerky. "Not exactly a fine hotel dinner, but it'll keep our strength up." As Kyle busied himself preparing a simple meal, Katherine sank onto a chair, exhaustion suddenly overwhelming her. The events of the day, the breakdown, the heat, the desperate ride through the rain crashed over her like a wave. "Why were you traveling alone?" Kyle asked, his back to her as he worked. Katherine considered how to answer. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure how much to reveal to this stranger. Still, he had rescued her, and the isolation of the cabin created an odd intimacy that made honesty seem natural. "I've accepted a position as the schoolteacher in Carson City," she said. "They're opening a proper school, and I'm to be the first teacher." "All the way from," Kyle prompted, "Philadelphia, originally anyway. I've been teaching in San Francisco for the past year." Kyle whistled softly. "That's quite a journey for a young woman alone." "I'm hardly young," Katherine replied with a small smile. "I'm 26. "Practically ancient," Kyle agreed, the corners of his eyes crinkling with humor as he handed her a tin cup of coffee. The warmth of the cup seeped into Katherine's cold hands. "What about you, Mr. Hawkins? What brings a cowboy to this particular stretch of desert today?" A shadow passed over Kyle's face. "Business in Carson City. Cattle contract negotiations." He hesitated. "And I'm not exactly a cowboy. I'm foreman at the Silver Dollar." "A responsible position," Katherine observed. "It has its moments." Kyle settled onto the other chair, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "The owner's getting on in years, leaves most decisions to me these days." They fell into companionable silence, sipping coffee and listening to the rain. Katherine found herself studying Kyle when he wasn't looking, the confident way he moved, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the capable hands that held his coffee cup. There was something reassuring about him, a quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had in months. "You should rest," Kyle said eventually. "Take the cot, I'll keep watch." "Watch for what?" Katherine asked, Force of habit, he replied with a shrug. Been caught in too many situations where letting your guard down means not waking up. The casual statement sent a chill through Katherine that had nothing to do with her damp hair. What kind of life had this man led that constant vigilance was second nature? The West was still wild in many ways. She knew it was part of what had drawn her to it after the suffocating propriety of Eastern society, but Kyle's words hinted at specific dangers rather than general caution. "I'm not tired," she lied, unwilling to take the only bed while he sat up all night. Kyle's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Stubborn, aren't you? Useful quality for a schoolteacher, I imagine." "Essential," Katherine agreed, returning his smile. As the evening wore on, the rain gradually lessened to a gentle patter. They talked about the Silver Dollar Ranch, about Katherine's teaching experiences, about the changing territory of Nevada. Kyle proved to be well-informed and thoughtful, not at all the rough cowhand Katherine had initially taken him for. He spoke of cattle breeding techniques and water management with the knowledge of someone who'd studied the subjects, not merely learned by doing. "You're educated," Katherine observed during a lull in conversation. Kyle's expression closed slightly. "My father believed in education." Past tense. "He died when I was 19. Influenza." Kyle stared into the fire. "After that, college didn't seem important anymore." "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. Kyle nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate further. Instead, he changed the subject. "Why Carson City?" "Plenty of established schools back east would welcome an experienced teacher." It was Katherine's turn to look away. "I needed a fresh start." "Running from something?" Kyle asked, his tone neutral. "Not running, just seeking something different." Katherine fidgeted with a loose thread on the oversized sweater. "In Philadelphia, I was always Katherine Alvarez, daughter of Judge Alvarez. In San Francisco, I was Katherine Alvarez, fiancée of Edward Blackburn. And in Carson City, just Katherine Alvarez, teacher." She smiled faintly. "It's surprisingly liberating to be defined solely by what you do rather than by your connections." "I understand that better than you might think," Kyle said quietly. Their eyes met across the small space, and Katherine felt an unexpected connection, a recognition of kindred spirits, despite their vastly different backgrounds. The moment was broken by a particularly loud crack of thunder that made Katherine jump. Kyle was on his feet instantly, moving to the door to check outside. "Still coming down, but the worst has passed," he reported. "We should be able to head out at first light." Katherine nodded, suddenly aware of how late it must be. The fire had burned low, and her eyelids felt heavy despite her earlier protest about not being tired. "You should take the cot," Kyle said again. "I'll be fine here." He gestured to his position by the fire. This time, Katherine didn't argue. She was exhausted, and the prospect of horizontal rest was too tempting to resist. "Wake me if you need to sleep," she insisted as she moved to the narrow bed. Kyle nodded, though they both knew he wouldn't. Katherine stretched out on the cot, pulling a rough woolen blanket over herself. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was Kyle Hawkins silhouetted against the dying fire, his profile strong and watchful in the golden light. When Katherine woke, pale dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window. She blinked in momentary confusion, then remembered everything: the broken stagecoach, the storm, the cowboy who'd brought her to safety. Speaking of whom, Kyle sat at the table, his head resting on his folded arms. He'd fallen asleep there, keeping his promise to let her have the cot. Something about the vulnerability of his sleeping form touched Katherine deeply. This man who'd shown only strength and capability now looked almost boyish, his face relaxed in slumber. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb him. Her own clothes had dried overnight, though they were wrinkled and still bore the dust stains from yesterday's ordeal. Still, they were preferable to traveling to Carson City dressed in men's clothing. She gathered the borrowed garments and slipped behind a blanket she hung for privacy to change. When she emerged, Kyle was awake, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Apologies for dozing off. You needed rest as much as I did," Katherine replied. "Is the storm over?" Kyle moved to the door and opened it. Sunlight streamed in, along with the earthy scent of rain-soaked desert. "Cleared out completely. Roads will be muddy, but passable." They shared a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack from the cabin's supplies, then prepared to leave. Kyle checked on Ajax, who seemed none the worse for the previous day's hard ride. "Can he carry us both again?" Katherine asked, concerned for the animal. "He's stronger than he looks," Kyle assured her, patting the stallion's muscular neck. "And it's only about 3 hours to Carson City if we take it slow." This time, Katherine mounted behind Kyle with less awkwardness, though the awareness of his proximity remained acute. She placed her hands lightly on his sides as before, but as soon as Ajax began moving, she found herself holding on more firmly than she'd intended. The desert after rain was transformed. What had been parched brown earth yesterday now showed hints of green where dormant seeds had sprung to life overnight. The air smelled clean and fresh, and birds called to one another from scrubby bushes. They rode mostly in silence, the steady rhythm of Ajax's hooves creating a hypnotic cadence. After about an hour, Kyle pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a lone tree that somehow survived in the harsh environment, the distant mountains that sheltered Carson City. "What will you do about your trunks?" Kyle asked over his shoulder. "I suppose I'll have to hire someone to retrieve them," Katherine replied. "No need. I meant what I said about arranging their recovery. I'll send one of my men out today with a wagon." "That's very kind, but no arguments," Kyle interrupted. "Consider it a welcome to Nevada gesture." Katherine wanted to protest further. She didn't like being beholden to anyone, but she recognized the practicality of his offer. She had no idea how to organize such a retrieval herself, and hiring strangers would be costly. "Thank you," she said simply. They crested a small rise, and suddenly, Carson City spread before them in the valley below. It was larger than Katherine had expected, a proper town with multiple streets, substantial buildings, and even a few trees lining what appeared to be the main thoroughfare. After months of travel and uncertainty, the sight of her destination brought a rush of emotion Katherine hadn't anticipated. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not Philadelphia," Kyle noted. "No," Katherine agreed. "Better." As they approached the town's outskirts, Katherine became increasingly aware of her disheveled appearance. What kind of first impression would she make on the town council members who'd hired her sight unseen? Her hair was a tangled mess, her dress wrinkled and stained. Not to mention she was arriving on horseback behind a man she'd just met. "I must look a fright," she muttered. Kyle glanced back at her, his blue eyes warm with something that might have been admiration. "You look like a woman who survived a desert storm," he said. "Nothing to be ashamed of in that." His words, simple as they were, steadied her. Yes, she had survived not just the storm, but everything that had driven her west in the first place. She sat straighter as they rode into town. Carson City hummed with activity. Wagons and riders moved along the streets. Shopkeepers arranged displays outside their establishments, and everywhere was evidence of a town growing rapidly into something substantial. Katherine noticed a large new building at the end of the main street, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. "The school," Kyle said, following her gaze, "finished just last month from what I heard." A mixture of excitement and nervousness fluttered in Katherine's stomach. Her school, her new beginning. "Where should I take you first?" Kyle asked as they approached the town center. "The hotel." "The school." "The hotel, I think," Katherine decided. "I need to make myself presentable before meeting anyone officially." Kyle nodded and guided Ajax toward a 2-story building with Ormsby House painted across its facade in bold letters. He dismounted first, then helped Katherine down. After hours in the saddle, her legs felt unsteady and she gripped Kyle's forearms for balance. Their faces were briefly inches apart, close enough that she could see flecks of gray in his blue eyes. "Thank you," she said, stepping back quickly. "For everything." "My pleasure, Miss Alvarez." Kyle's formal tone contrasted with the warmth in his eyes. "I'll see about your trunks immediately." A peculiar reluctance to part ways came over Katherine. This man was still largely a stranger, yet in the space of a day, he'd become something more: a guardian, perhaps even a friend. "Will you be in town long?" she asked, trying to sound merely polite rather than eager. "A few days. Need to finalize that cattle contract with the territorial governor's office." Kyle adjusted his hat. "Perhaps I could call on you tomorrow, make sure you're settling in properly." "I'd like that," Katherine replied, surprised by her own quick response. Kyle smiled, a full smile this time, not the half version he'd shown before. It transformed his weathered face, revealing a dimple in his left cheek and lighting up his eyes. "Until tomorrow, then," he said with a small bow. He mounted Ajax with easy grace and tipped his hat before riding away, leaving Katherine standing before the hotel with her small satchel and a strange, light feeling in her chest. The Ormsby House proved to be a respectable establishment, though far from luxurious. Katherine secured a room, grateful that she'd kept her money with her rather than in the abandoned trunks. After a real bath, her first in days, and a change into the one spare dress from her satchel, she felt human again. Her next stop was the school. As she approached the new building, Katherine noted details she'd missed from a distance: the sturdy construction, the row of windows designed to let in maximum light, the small bell tower. It was a practical structure, but someone had taken care with the aesthetics as well, adding decorative elements to the roofline and painting the doors a cheerful blue. "Miss Alvarez." Katherine turned to find a portly gentleman with impressive side whiskers hurrying toward her. "Yes, I'm Katherine Alvarez," she confirmed. "Harold Yarrington, town council," the man said, pumping her hand enthusiastically. "We'd nearly given up hope when the stagecoach arrived without you yesterday. The driver said you'd stayed with the disabled coach." "I did, but fortunately Mr. Hawkins came along and helped me reach town before the storm hit." "Hawkins?" Yarrington's bushy eyebrows rose. "Kyle Hawkins?" "Yes, do you know him?" "Everyone knows the Silver Dollar foreman," Yarrington said, his tone odd. "Come, let me show you the school. The children are eager to meet their new teacher." As they walked, Yarrington chatted about the town's growth, the importance of education to Carson City's future, and the 16 children currently enrolled. Katherine listened attentively, but part of her mind remained on his reaction to Kyle's name. There had been something like surprise, perhaps even concern, in the councilman's voice. The school interior exceeded Katherine's expectations: clean pine floors, rows of sturdy desks, a proper blackboard, and most surprisingly, a small library alcove with several dozen books. "This is wonderful," she told Yarrington honestly. "We aim to be more than just a mining town," he replied proudly. "With the territorial capital here and statehood on the horizon, Carson City needs proper institutions." They discussed practicalities: her salary, living arrangements, a small house behind the school, and when classes would begin. Katherine was pleased to learn she had a week to prepare before students arrived. "About Mr. Hawkins," Katherine said as they concluded their tour. "He kindly offered to retrieve my trunks from the disabled stagecoach. Is he trustworthy?" Yarrington hesitated. "Hawkins is complicated. Efficient at his job, certainly. The silver dollar runs like clockwork under his management, but he has a past." "What sort of past?" Katherine pressed when Yarrington didn't elaborate. "It's not my place to gossip," the councilman said, looking uncomfortable. "Just be cautious, Miss Alvarez. A school teacher's reputation must be above reproach." Before Katherine could question him further, a woman entered the schoolhouse introducing herself as Mrs. Yarrington, and the conversation shifted to household matters and introductions to other town ladies. By the time Katherine returned to her hotel room that evening, her head was swimming with names, faces, and information about her new home. Despite her exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. Katherine found herself replaying the events of the past 2 days, particularly her interactions with Kyle Hawkins. What past had Yarrington been referring to? And why would association with the silver dollar foreman potentially damage her reputation? These questions still occupied her mind when a knock at her door the next morning startled her from a light doze. She hadn't slept well, but years of teaching had trained her to function regardless. She quickly dressed and opened the door to find a hotel porter with a message. "Delivered early this morning, madam," the young man said, handing her a folded paper. The note was brief and written in a strong, clear hand. "Miss Alvarez, your trunks have been recovered and will arrive in Carson City by noon today. I've taken the liberty of having them delivered directly to your new residence behind the school. If agreeable to you, I would be honored to escort you to dinner this evening at 7 o'clock. Respectfully, K. Hawkins." Katherine read the note twice, her pulse quickening. The practical part of her was relieved about the trunks. The other part, the part that had lain awake thinking about blue eyes and capable hands, was thrilled at the prospect of seeing Kyle again. Yet Yarrington's warning echoed in her mind. What was she getting herself into? After a moment's deliberation, she penned a reply accepting the dinner invitation, then spent the day familiarizing herself with the school curriculum and exploring the town. Carson City was a curious blend of frontier ruggedness and emerging civilization. Saloons and gambling establishments stood alongside a proper courthouse, churches, and even a small theater. Women in fashionable dresses shopped at dry goods stores while nearby, rough-looking miners and cowboys conducted their business. At the appointed hour, Katherine waited in the hotel lobby, wearing the best dress she'd kept in her satchel, a dark blue silk that brought out the warm brown of her eyes. She'd spent more time than usual arranging her hair, twisted into an elegant knot at the nape of her neck with a few strategic curls framing her face. When Kyle entered the lobby, Katherine almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the dust-covered cowboy in work clothes. In his place stood a gentleman in a well-tailored dark suit, crisp white shirt, and silk cravat. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw cleanly shaven. Only the weather-bronzed skin and those distinctive blue eyes remained the same. "Miss Alvarez," he said, approaching with a slight bow. "You look lovely." "Thank you, Mr. Hawkins," Katherine replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I own more than trail clothes despite appearances." He offered his arm. "Shall we? I've reserved a table at Curry's. Best restaurant in town." Curry's proved to be a genuinely elegant establishment, with linen tablecloths, crystal glasses, and a menu featuring dishes Katherine hadn't expected to find in a frontier town. Kyle guided her to a corner table and held her chair with practiced ease. "I'm impressed," Katherine said, looking around. "This isn't what I imagined when you suggested dinner." "Disappointed?" Kyle asked, amusement glinting in his eyes. "Were you expecting beans around a campfire?" "Perhaps not quite that primitive," Katherine laughed. "But I am curious about the transformation. The Kyle Hawkins who rescued me seems quite different from the man sitting before me now." Something flickered across Kyle's face, a shadow of the guardedness she'd glimpsed before. "Both are equally real," he said after a moment. "But I find different circumstances call for different aspects of oneself. Like wearing a mask," Katherine suggested, "more like knowing which tool is right for which job." Kyle studied her over the rim of his water glass. "You must do the same." The school teacher is one facet of Katherine Alvarez, but not the whole. The observation was startlingly perceptive. "You're right," Katherine admitted, "though I sometimes worry the teacher is consuming all other parts of me." Their conversation flowed easily through dinner, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd visited, and amusing stories from their respective professions. Kyle spoke of Nevada's bid for statehood and the changes it would bring, while Katherine described her vision for the school's future. It was only when the dessert course arrived that Kyle broached a more personal subject. "I imagine the town council has been filling your ear about me," he said casually, too casually. Katherine considered denying it, then opted for honesty. "Mr. Yarrington mentioned you have a past." "He seemed concerned about my association with you." Kyle nodded, unsurprised. "Did he elaborate?" "No, and I didn't press for details. But you're curious." Katherine met his gaze directly. "Yes." Kyle set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. "It's not a secret, though it's not something I advertise either." He took a breath. "Before I became foreman at the Silver Dollar, I worked as a deputy U.S. Marshal. Of all the revelations Katherine had imagined, this wasn't one of them. A lawman. But why would that concern Yarrington?" "Because my last assignment ended badly." Kyle's voice lowered. "I was part of a team tracking a gang that had robbed 3 banks across the territory. We cornered them near Carson City. Things escalated. 4 gang members died. So did my partner and 2 bystanders." Katherine's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." Kyle's eyes had turned distant, seeing something far beyond the restaurant walls. "I killed 2 of the gang members myself. One was 19 years old." He refocused on Katherine. "I resigned my badge the next day, couldn't stomach it anymore." "That's why you're so vigilant," Katherine realized. "Why you said letting your guard down means not waking up." Kyle nodded. "Old habits. The thing is, some folks in town, especially those who lost friends or family in the shootout, blame me for how it was handled. They think I was too aggressive, that negotiations could have prevented bloodshed." "And could they have?" "I ask myself that question every day," Kyle replied quietly. "I don't know, maybe, maybe not. The gang leader was unpredictable, desperate, but I'll never be certain." Katherine reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You did your duty as you saw fit." Kyle turned his hand to clasp hers briefly. "Thank you." He released her hand and straightened, visibly shifting back to lighter ground. "So now you know the past Yarrington was worried about. Will it affect your willingness to be seen with me?" The question was posed lightly, but Katherine detected real concern beneath. "Mr. Hawkins," she said firmly, "I'm quite capable of deciding for myself whose company I wish to keep." A genuine smile spread across Kyle's face. "I'm very glad to hear it." As they left the restaurant, the night air had turned cool, and Kyle placed his jacket around Katherine's shoulders without comment. The gesture was both gentlemanly and intimate, making her acutely aware of his presence beside her as they strolled back toward the hotel. "May I ask about your past?" Kyle inquired after they'd walked in comfortable silence for a time. You mentioned being a fiancé in San Francisco. What happened? Katherine hesitated. Her broken engagement wasn't something she discussed freely. Yet Kyle had shared his demons. Fairness demanded reciprocity. Edward Blackburn was a business associate of my father's, she began. Charming, successful, 15 years my senior. He pursued me aggressively after my father died when my mother and I were struggling financially. I was flattered by his attention, and practical considerations made the match seem sensible. Practical considerations, Kyle repeated. Not love. I thought perhaps love would grow with time, Katherine said. We were engaged for nearly a year. Then I discovered he'd been unfaithful repeatedly, with multiple women. I'm sorry, Kyle said softly. Katherine shrugged. The betrayal hurt, of course, but what truly opened my eyes was realizing I felt more relief than heartbreak. I'd been sleepwalking into a loveless marriage because it seemed the expected path. So you broke the engagement and came west. San Francisco first, where I taught at a girls' school. Then the Carson City position was advertised and it seemed perfect. A fresh start in a place where no one knew me as Judge Alvarez's daughter or Edward Blackburn's jilted fiancé. Katherine smiled ruefully. Though I suppose I've just surrendered that anonymity with you. Your secret is safe, Kyle assured her. And for what it's worth, Blackburn was a fool. They had reached the hotel, but neither seemed eager to end the evening. Kyle studied her face in the lamplight, his expression serious. Katherine, he said, using her given name for the first time. I'd like to see you again, regularly, but you should know what you're getting into. My reputation in this town is complicated, as you've learned. And the silver dollar keeps me busy. I'm often away for days at a time. If friendship is all you wish, I'll respect that boundary, but I want to be clear about my intentions. The directness of his statement took Katherine's breath away. In Philadelphia, courtship was conducted through innuendo and social ritual. Here was a man stating plainly that he was interested in her, with no games or pretense. I'd like that, she replied, matching his honesty with her own. Though I have my own complications. As the town's teacher, I'll be held to certain standards of behavior. We'll be discreet, Kyle promised, then smiled. Well, as discreet as possible in a town where everyone knows everyone else's business by breakfast. Katherine laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. Then I look forward to our next meeting, Mr. Hawkins. Kyle, please. Kyle, she repeated, testing the familiarity. Good night. He took her hand and raised it to his lips, a gesture that would have seemed affected from another man but felt entirely natural from him. Good night, Katherine. As she watched him walk away, Katherine knew two things with certainty. Carson City was indeed going to be a new beginning, and Kyle Hawkins was going to be a significant part of it. The following weeks established patterns that would shape Katherine's new life. School began, bringing 16 eager and occasionally unruly students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. She quickly discovered that teaching on the frontier required different approaches than in Philadelphia or even San Francisco. These children came from diverse backgrounds, the sons and daughters of miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, and government officials with wildly varying levels of previous education. Katherine adapted, creating individual learning plans and using the older students to help teach the younger ones. She introduced weekly nature studies that took advantage of the unique desert environment and incorporated local history into her lessons. Parents, initially wary of an Eastern teacher with fancy ideas, gradually warmed to her practical approach and genuine interest in their children's progress. And then there was Kyle. True to his word, he called on her regularly, sometimes for formal dinners, sometimes for simple picnics in the hills surrounding Carson City. He sent notes when work kept him away, along with small, thoughtful gifts. A rare book he'd found in Virginia City, wildflowers pressed between paper, once even a tiny sketch he'd made of Ajax. Katherine learned he had a talent for drawing that he rarely indulged. Kyle was unlike any man she'd known before. Educated enough to discuss literature and politics intelligently, yet completely at home in the rugged outdoors. Formal when the situation required it, but capable of relaxing into easy camaraderie. His former life as a marshal had left him with a vigilance that never fully disappeared, but Katherine came to find it comforting rather than concerning. She learned about his childhood in Missouri, where his father had been a judge much like her own. About his brief time at university before family circumstances called him home. About his drift westward after his parents' deaths, the years as a marshal, and finally his arrival at the Silver Dollar 5 years ago. "I was at loose ends," Kyle explained during one of their walks. "After I resigned my badge, I felt purposeless. I took odd jobs, freight hauling, horse breaking, even dealt cards for a while. Nothing stuck." "How did you end up at the Silver Dollar?" Katherine asked. "Pure chance." "I was passing through Carson City when I stopped a runaway wagon from plowing into a group of schoolchildren. The owner of the Silver Dollar, Frank Reynolds, was watching. Offered me a job on the spot, just regular ranch handwork at first. But I knew cattle from my youth in Missouri, and I've always had a good head for business. Within a year, I was helping manage the herd records. When the foreman retired 2 years later, Frank promoted me." "And now you practically run the place," Katherine observed. Kyle nodded. "Frank's health isn't good. His heart's weak. He trusts me to handle most decisions. No family to take over. A son back east who wants nothing to do with ranching. Went to law school, practices in Boston now." As October gave way to November, Katherine realized with some surprise that she'd been in Carson City for nearly 2 months. The desert was changing, with the season nights growing longer and colder, days crisp rather than scorching. And something else was changing too. Her feelings for Kyle had deepened beyond attraction or friendship. She found herself watching for him from her schoolhouse window, her heart quickening whenever she spotted him riding into town. Their conversations had grown more personal, more meaningful. Often their walks included long periods of comfortable silence where words seemed unnecessary. Sometimes their hands would brush as they walked, neither acknowledging the contact, but neither pulling away either. There were obstacles, of course. The town's opinion of their friendship was mixed. Most people had accepted Kyle's version of the shooting incident, but a vocal minority still viewed him with suspicion. More problematic was Katherine's position. As she'd predicted, the school board held her to stringent standards of behavior. Yarrington had already mentioned, with pointed delicacy, that a school teacher should be careful about keeping appropriate company. Katherine was contemplating these complications one Friday afternoon as she tidied the schoolroom after dismissing her students for the weekend. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting a parent or perhaps a student who'd forgotten something. Instead, Kyle entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He wore his working clothes, denim trousers, flannel shirt, leather vest, and carried saddlebags over one shoulder. "Kyle," Katherine exclaimed, unable to hide her pleasure. "I thought you were still at the ranch." "Just got back," he said, crossing the room to her. "Brought something for you." From his saddlebags, he produced a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Open it," he urged, his eyes bright with anticipation. Katherine untied the string and carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal a book, a beautiful leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poems. "It's first edition," Kyle said. "Found it in Sacramento last week." Katherine ran her fingers over the embossed cover. "Kyle, this is too extravagant. You mentioned Tennyson was your favorite," he said simply. "And I missed your birthday last month. How did you know when my birthday was?" A smile played around his mouth. "I might have asked Mrs. Peters at the Mercantile. She seems to know everything about everyone." Katherine laughed. "Thank you, it's beautiful." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I've missed you. I've missed you too." Kyle's voice had dropped lower, intimate. "More than I expected to." There was a moment of charged silence, both of them hovering on the edge of something profound. Then Kyle took a deliberate step back, breaking the tension. "I actually came to invite you to the Silver Dollar," he said. "Frank's feeling better and he's curious about the woman I can't stop talking about. Thought you might like to ride out tomorrow, spend the day. I'd have you back by evening." "I'd love to," Katherine replied, both disappointed and relieved by the shift in mood. "What time should I be ready?" They arranged the details, and Kyle left shortly after, citing ranch business in town. Katherine watched him go, clutching the book of poems to her chest, wondering if he'd deliberately avoided the moment that had nearly happened between them. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost sparkling on the desert sage. Katherine dressed warmly in her sturdiest skirt and boots, with multiple layers beneath her coat. Kyle arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, leading a gentle-looking bay mare alongside Ajax. "Thought you might prefer your own mount for the ride out," he explained. "This is Penny. She belongs to Frank's niece, who visits occasionally." The ride to the Silver Dollar took just over an hour. As they traveled, Kyle pointed out landmarks and boundaries of the ranch's extensive holdings. Katherine was impressed by the scale of the operation, thousands of acres supporting several thousand head of cattle, with multiple line camps, a dozen full-time cowhands, and a substantial main ranch complex. "It's beautiful," she said as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the ranch buildings nestled in a sheltered valley. A substantial two-story house formed the centerpiece, surrounded by barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and outbuildings. "Home," Kyle said simply, but the pride in his voice was evident. They rode down into the valley, where activity hummed around the ranch yard. Men nodded respectfully to Kyle as they passed, eyeing Katherine with undisguised curiosity. Kyle helped her dismount in front of the main house, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Frank's waiting inside," he said. "Fair warning, he's opinionated and doesn't filter his thoughts, but his heart's good." Frank Reynolds proved to be a gaunt man in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and piercing gray eyes that missed nothing. He sat in a wheelchair by the fire in a comfortably furnished parlor, wrapped in blankets despite the room's warmth. "So you're the schoolteacher who's got my foreman riding into town every chance he gets," Frank said after Kyle made the introductions. "Sit down and let me look at you properly." Katherine took the offered chair, amused rather than offended by the old man's bluntness. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Reynolds. Kyle speaks highly of you." "Does he now? Probably tells you I'm a cantankerous old coot." "His exact words were smartest cattleman in the territory," Katherine replied smoothly. Frank barked a laugh. "She's quick, Kyle, I'll give you that." He fixed Katherine with a penetrating stare. "You're from money, East Coast. Your daddy was somebody important." Katherine blinked, startled by the accurate assessment. "My father was a federal judge in Philadelphia. How did you know? The way you hold yourself, the way you speak, quality shows." Frank nodded as if confirming something to himself. "What brings a judge's daughter to teach school in Carson City?" "Adventure. Independence. The chance to build something meaningful," Katherine answered honestly. Frank studied her for a long moment, then turned to Kyle. "I like her. She'll do." Kyle's ears reddened. "Frank, don't frank me, boy. I'm old, not blind." The rancher shifted his attention back to Katherine. "He's the son I should have had. Knows this ranch better than I do now. It'll be his someday soon." Katherine glanced at Kyle, whose expression had grown shuttered. Clearly, this was a sensitive topic. "You'll outlive us all, old man," Kyle said lightly. "Now, if you're done interrogating Miss Alvarez, I promise to show her the ranch." Frank waved them away, but as Katherine rose to leave, he caught her hand. "He deserves happiness," the old man said quietly. "So do you, I expect." Katherine squeezed his thin fingers gently. "I'll remember that." Outside, Kyle shook his head ruefully. "I apologize for Frank. Subtlety isn't his strong suit." "I liked him," Katherine said. "He reminds me of my father, seeing straight to the heart of matters." Kyle's tour of the ranch was comprehensive, reflecting his evident pride in the operation. He showed her the breeding program he'd developed, the water management systems he'd implemented, and the new methods of winter feeding that had significantly reduced cattle losses during harsh weather. "You've built something remarkable here," Katherine observed as they walked through a newly constructed barn where pregnant heifers were sheltered. "Frank built it," Kyle corrected. "I'm just maintaining it." "That's not how Frank sees it, and it's not what I see either." Katherine stopped walking and turned to face him directly. "Why does his mention of leaving you the ranch make you uncomfortable?" Kyle was silent for a long moment, absently stroking the nose of a curious heifer who had approached the fence. "Because I'm not sure I deserve it," he finally said. "And because there's a son who should rightfully inherit, regardless of whether he wants it now." "Have you spoken to Frank about this?" "Many times. He's stubborn," Kyle sighed. "And there's more. The shooting incident I told you about. One of the bystanders who died was Martin Wheeler, brother-in-law to Carson City's mayor. The Wheeler family blames me personally. If Frank leaves me the silver dollar, they'll contest the will. It could tie up the ranch in legal battles for years." Understanding dawned. "That's why you've been so cautious about us. Not just my reputation as a teacher, but this potential conflict." Kyle met her eyes. "Partly. And partly because you deserve better than a man with my baggage." "Shouldn't that be my decision?" Katherine asked softly. Before Kyle could answer, a ranch hand hurried into the barn, breathless. "Boss, trouble at the north pasture. Fire." Kyle's demeanor changed instantly, all personal concerns subsumed by immediate action. "Alert everyone. Get the water wagons. And find Rodriguez, have him escort Miss Alvarez back to the house." "Kyle," Katherine began. "I need to go," he said firmly. "Range fires move fast this time of year. Stay with Frank. I'll be back when I can." He was gone before she could protest further, shouting orders as he ran toward the stables. A young Mexican cowhand appeared moments later to escort her back to the main house, politely but firmly refusing her offers to help. At the house, Frank was being attended by an elderly housekeeper who introduced herself as Mrs. Navarro. The old rancher waved Katherine to a seat, his expression worried. "North pasture, they said," he muttered. "Winds from the east today. Could spread to Carson Peak if they don't contain it quickly." "Is there anything I can do?" Katherine asked. Frank shook his head. "Kyle knows what he's doing. Best fire tactician I've ever seen." He glanced at her anxiously clasped hands. "He'll be all right, not his first fire." As afternoon stretched into evening, Katherine found herself pacing the parlor, peering out windows for any sign of the firefighting party's return. Mrs. Navarro provided a simple but hearty dinner which neither she nor Frank ate much of. Outside, the sun set and darkness fell, while in the distance, an ominous orange glow could be seen against the night sky. "Should be back by now," Frank said, voicing Katherine's own concerns. "Unless it jumped the creek." It was past midnight when the sound of horses and men's voices finally reached the house. Katherine rushed to the door, Frank wheeling himself close behind. Riders were dismounting in the yard, their faces black with soot, clothing singed and smoky. Kyle was among the last to arrive, directing men to care for exhausted horses before seeing to their own needs. When he finally turned toward the house and saw Katherine waiting, something in his expression shifted. He crossed the yard quickly, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "You're still here," he said, sounding surprised. "I thought Rodriguez would have taken you back to town." "I couldn't leave without knowing you were safe," Katherine replied. She reached up without thinking to touch a smudge of ash on his cheekbone. "Are you hurt?" Kyle caught her hand, holding it against his face for a brief moment before gently lowering it. "Nothing serious. Some minor burns. We lost about 50 acres of grazing land, but no cattle and no men. Could have been much worse." Frank cleared his throat pointedly. "Report foreman." Kyle turned to his employer, professional once more. "Fires contained. We backburned from the creek and managed to turn it north toward the rocky outcroppings where it couldn't spread. Rain would help ensure it's fully extinguished, but the men will monitor for hotspots through the night." Frank nodded approval. "Good work. Now get cleaned up before you track soot all over my house." Kyle glanced from Frank to Katherine. "It's too late to take you back to town tonight. Mrs. Navarro has prepared the blue room for Miss Alvarez," Frank announced, "and left hot water for your bath in your quarters. Off with you now. You stink of smoke." Despite the dire events of the evening, Katherine found herself smiling at the old man's blunt manner. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Reynolds. Frank, girl, call me Frank." An hour later, Katherine sat in the comfortable guest bedroom, wearing a borrowed nightgown and wrapper that Mrs. Navarro had provided. Sleep seemed impossible with her mind racing over the day's events. The revelation about Frank's intention to leave Kyle the ranch, the fire, the moment in the barn when they'd been on the verge of acknowledging what was growing between them. A soft knock at the door startled her. She wrapped the dressing gown more securely around herself before opening the door a cautious few inches. Kyle stood in the hallway, clean and changed into fresh clothes, his damp hair curling slightly at the temples. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said quietly. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you need." "I'm fine," Katherine assured him. "Mrs. Navarro has been very kind. How are your burns?" "Just singed sleeves, mostly. May I come in for a moment? I won't stay long." Propriety dictated she refuse. Common sense suggested the same. Instead, Katherine opened the door wider and stepped back to allow him entry. Kyle remained near the doorway, maintaining a respectful distance. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been cautious, perhaps unfairly so." "You've been protecting me," Katherine replied, "and yourself." "Yes," he met her eyes directly. "But today, when that fire broke out, all I could think was that I might not get back to finish what we started talking about, that I might lose the chance to tell you." He paused, searching for words. "Tell me what?" Katherine prompted softly. "That I'm in love with you," Kyle said simply. "That I have been almost since I found you standing beside that broken stagecoach. That I've been fighting it because of all the complications, your position, my past, the ranch situation, but I'm tired of fighting. I want a future with you, Katherine, if you'll have me." The directness of his declaration took her breath away. There were no flowery phrases or poetic comparisons, just honest emotion plainly stated. It was so like him, so perfectly Kyle, that Katherine felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm in love with you too," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. "I've never felt this way about anyone before, not Edward certainly, not anyone." Kyle crossed the room in 2 strides, gathering her hands in his. "I can't offer you an easy path," he warned. "There will be opposition, complications. I didn't come west looking for easy," Katherine reminded him. Kyle's smile was tender as he released one of her hands to touch her cheek. "May I kiss you, Katherine Alvarez?" In answer, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss began gently, almost tentatively, but quickly deepened as months of restrained feeling broke free. Kyle's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while Katherine's hands slid up to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he murmured, "before I forget myself entirely." Katherine nodded, though part of her wanted him to stay. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." Kyle brushed a final kiss across her forehead, then reluctantly stepped back. "Sleep well, Katherine." "You too, Kyle." After he left, Katherine stood in the middle of the room, her fingers touching her lips where his had been, feeling as though her life had irrevocably changed course. Morning brought clarity and practical considerations. Over breakfast, with Frank tactfully absent, though Katherine suspected the old man had orchestrated the privacy, she and Kyle discussed their situation candidly. "The school board will have concerns," Katherine acknowledged. "Yarrington in particular. And the Wheeler family will object strongly to any connection between us," Kyle added. "Not to mention the gossips who'll have a field day with the school teacher and the ex-marshal. But we're both adults, free to make our own choices," Katherine pointed out. "I can speak with the school board. My contract doesn't forbid marriage, though it does have a morality clause." "Marriage," Kyle repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Is that what we're discussing, Miss Alvarez?" Katherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I was speaking hypothetically, of course." "Of course." Kyle's eyes sparkled with humor and something deeper. "Though hypothetically speaking, how would you feel about becoming Mrs. Hawkins someday, say after a proper courtship?" "I believe, hypothetically, I would be amenable to such an arrangement," Katherine replied, maintaining a prim tone despite the joy bubbling inside her. Kyle reached across the table to take her hand. "Then let's start with a proper courtship, in full view of Carson City. No secrets, no hiding. Just two people who found each other in the desert and decided to build a life together." "That sounds perfect," Katherine agreed. "Though perhaps we should wait to announce any hypothetical future plans until we've weathered the initial storm of gossip." Wise as always, school teacher. The journey back to Carson City that afternoon was filled with plans and possibilities. They agreed that Kyle would call formally at Katherine's cottage the following Sunday, beginning their public courtship in a way that even Yarrington couldn't find fault with. In the meantime, Kyle would speak with Frank about the ranch situation, seeking a resolution that might appease the Wheeler family without sacrificing Frank's wishes. As predicted, their courtship caused a stir in Carson City. Some, like Mrs. Peters at the Mercantile, expressed wholehearted approval. Others, particularly those connected to the Wheeler family, were openly hostile. The school board called a special meeting where Katherine was questioned about her association with a man of questionable character. "Mr. Hawkins is a respected businessman and the foreman of one of the largest cattle operations in the territory," Katherine said calmly when Yarrington raised the issue. "His past as a marshal, including the unfortunate incident 3 years ago, is a matter of public record. I've reviewed that record and spoken with witnesses. I'm satisfied that he acted as any lawman would under the circumstances." "Miss Alvarez," another board member said sternly, "you must understand our concerns. The school's reputation will be enhanced by my connection to a man who values education and has already donated books to our library," Katherine interrupted. "A man who rescued me at personal risk during a dangerous storm. A man who exemplifies the qualities we hope to instill in our students: honesty, integrity, and moral courage. In the end, the board grudgingly agreed that Katherine could continue teaching, with the understanding that her behavior would remain above reproach. It was a victory, albeit a qualified one. The Wheeler family proved more problematic. Though they couldn't directly interfere with Katherine and Kyle's relationship, they made their disapproval known throughout town. Businesses connected to the Wheeler interests suddenly found reasons not to serve Kyle, and anonymous letters appeared at the schoolhouse suggesting Katherine's morality was questionable. Through it all, Katherine and Kyle remained steadfast. Their Sunday afternoon walks became a regular fixture in Carson City. Kyle attended school functions as Katherine's escort, charming parents and delighting children with his knowledge of local wildlife. Katherine occasionally rode out to the Silver Dollar for dinner with Kyle and Frank, whose health continued to deteriorate despite his fighting spirit. Winter settled over Nevada, bringing snow to the mountains and frost to the desert. Christmas approached, and with it, the school's holiday pageant. Kyle helped build the stage and painted backdrops based on Katherine's designs. The evening of the performance, he sat in the front row, his face glowing with pride as Katherine's students performed scenes from Dickens and recited poetry they had memorized under her tutelage. Afterward, as parents and children mingled over hot cider and cookies, Kyle drew Katherine aside to a quiet corner of the schoolroom. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until Christmas proper, but tonight seems right." He withdrew a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a simple but elegant gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my mother's," Kyle explained. "Katherine Alvarez, I'm done with hypotheticals. Will you marry me? Not someday, but soon." "As soon as you're willing." Katherine stared at the ring, then at Kyle's earnest face. "What about the complications? The Wheeler family, the ranch situation. Frank has found a solution for the ranch. He's creating a trust. Part of the Silver Dollar will go to his son, but the operational control and the main house will come to me. It's fair, and his lawyers believe it will withstand any challenges." Kyle took her hand. "As for the Wheelers and anyone else who disapproves, let them talk. I'm tired of letting the past dictate our future." Katherine looked around the schoolroom at her students and their parents, at the community she'd become part of in just a few short months. Then she looked back at Kyle, the man who'd rescued her from more than just a desert storm. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "I'll marry you, Kyle Hawkins. The sooner the better." Kyle slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her hand where it now rested. "How does January sound, after the holiday break but before spring roundup starts?" "January sounds perfect," Katherine agreed. Then, because she couldn't help herself, she raised on tiptoe to kiss him quickly. Propriety be damned. A pointed throat clearing interrupted what might have become an indiscreet moment. They turned to find Harold Yarrington watching them, his expression complicated. "I see congratulations are in order," the councilman said, nodding toward Katherine's newly adorned hand. "Yes, sir," Kyle confirmed, keeping Katherine's hand in his. "I've asked Miss Alvarez to be my wife, and she's done me the honor of accepting." Yarrington studied them for a long moment. "The school board will need to be notified, of course. There are protocols regarding married teachers." Katherine tensed, preparing for opposition, but Yarrington surprised her. "However," he continued, "given the exemplary way Miss Alvarez has established our school and considering the shortage of qualified teachers in the territory, I believe we can make an exception in this case. Assuming, of course, that propriety is maintained until the wedding." "Of course," Katherine agreed quickly, relief washing through her. "Then may I be the first to officially offer my congratulations." Yarrington said, extending his hand first to Kyle, then to Katherine. Carson City is fortunate to be gaining such a determined couple. As word of their engagement spread through the room, well-wishers surrounded them. Mrs. Peters from the Mercantile wept happy tears. Katherine's students peppered her with questions about whether she would continue teaching, yes, and what they should call her after the wedding. Mrs. Hawkins would be fine. Even some of those who had been coolest toward Kyle offered cautious congratulations. By the time they left the schoolhouse that evening, it seemed that most of Carson City had accepted, if not wholeheartedly embraced, the upcoming union of the schoolteacher and the ranch foreman. That went better than expected, Kyle observed as he walked Katherine to her cottage. The pageant was a success, Katherine agreed. I meant the engagement announcement, Katherine laughed. I know, but I think the pageant helped. It's harder to disapprove of the teacher when your child just performed beautifully under her guidance. Clever woman. Did you plan it that way? Let's just say I considered all potential advantages of the timing, Katherine admitted with a smile. When they reached her door, Kyle took both her hands in his. 1 month, he said. 4 weeks until you're my wife. I can hardly believe it, Katherine murmured. When my stagecoach broke down in the desert, I never imagined that the cowboy who offered to get you to Carson City safely would end up being your husband, Kyle finished. Something like that. Katherine squeezed his hands. Though you're more than just a cowboy, as I quickly learned. And you're much more than just a schoolteacher, Kyle replied. You're the woman who makes me believe in second chances. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and adjustments. Frank Reynolds insisted on hosting the ceremony at the Silver Dollar, in the large parlor where Katherine had first met the old rancher. Mrs. Navarro and a team of ranch hands transformed the space with evergreen boughs, ribbons, and candles. Katherine's students created handmade decorations, while the ladies of Carson City organized a wedding supper that would feed half the town. Frank also had another surprise, a wedding gift of the foreman's house, a comfortable cabin near the main ranch house that he had ordered renovated and expanded. Can't have my foreman and his schoolteacher wife living in the bunkhouse, he declared when he showed them the property a week before the wedding. But my school, Katherine protested. I can't possibly ride all the way from here each day. Already solved, Frank said smugly. Bought you a buggy. Light, fast, good suspension. And Kyle will escort you whenever weather's bad or he's headed to town anyway. The gesture was so generous, so carefully thought out, that Katherine found herself embracing the frail old man with tears in her eyes. Thank you, Frank. For everything. Told you she was a good one, Frank said to Kyle over Katherine's shoulder, his own eyes suspiciously bright. Wedding day dawned clear and cold, January 21, 1869. Katherine dressed in her cottage in Carson City, where she would spend her last night as a single woman. Her wedding dress was cream-colored silk with lace trim, ordered from San Francisco based on Mrs. Peters' measurements, and adjusted by local seamstresses. Her veil was borrowed from the mayor's wife, a peace offering of sorts from the Wheeler family connection, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings as something old. Marion Lewis, mother of one of Katherine's students, helped arrange her hair and served as an impromptu maid of honor. At precisely noon, a carriage arrived to transport Katherine to the Silver Dollar, where Kyle and their guests awaited. The ranch looked festive, with evergreen garlands decorating the porch and lanterns ready to be lit when evening fell. As the carriage approached the main house, Katherine caught glimpses of people milling about, townspeople in their Sunday best, ranch hands in clean shirts and polished boots, even a few Paiute from the nearby reservation who had trading relationships with the Silver Dollar. Inside, the parlor had been arranged with rows of chairs facing the fireplace, where a minister from Carson City waited with Kyle. Frank sat in his wheelchair in the front row, dressed in a suit that hung loosely on his thin frame but with his eyes bright and alert. When Katherine entered on the arm of Harold Yarrington, who had unexpectedly offered to stand in for her late father, a hush fell over the assembly. Katherine barely noticed. Her gaze was fixed on Kyle, standing tall and handsome in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to undisguised adoration as he saw her. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Katherine would later remember fragments: the warmth of Kyle's hands holding hers, the slight tremor in his voice as he recited his vows, the solid weight of the gold band he slipped onto her finger to join her engagement ring. Most of all, she would remember the kiss that sealed their union, gentle yet promising, brief yet profound. "May I present Mr. and Mrs. Kyle Hawkins," the minister announced, and the room erupted in cheers and applause. What followed was a celebration, unlike anything Katherine had experienced before. The formality of Eastern weddings gave way to the exuberant spirit of the West. There was dancing to fiddle music, feasting on roast beef and venison, toasts with champagne that Frank had ordered specially from San Francisco. Katherine's students presented her with a handmade quilt, each square embroidered with their names. Kyle's ranch hands gave them a fine saddle for Katherine, inscribed with her new initials. As evening deepened, guests gradually departed, some returning to town, others staying in the bunkhouses and guest rooms that Frank had arranged. Finally, only family remained: Frank, Mrs. Navarro, who was like a mother to Kyle, and a few key ranch hands who were more brothers than employees. "Time for you two to retire," Frank announced with characteristic bluntness. "Got your own place waiting, all warmed up and ready." Katherine blushed, but Kyle merely grinned and helped her with her wrap. They said their good nights, promising to join Frank for breakfast the next morning before Katherine needed to return to town for Monday's school session. The foreman's house, their home now, was a short walk from the main house. Kyle insisted on carrying Katherine across the threshold, setting her down gently in a parlor warmed by a crackling fire. She looked around, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the bookshelves already stocked with both her books and Kyle's, the touches that made it uniquely theirs. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hawkins," Kyle said softly. Katherine turned to him, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she felt. "I love you," she said simply. Kyle's answer was to draw her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the emotion words couldn't express. Later, much later, as they lay entwined beneath warm quilts while January winds whispered outside their window, Katherine reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. A broken stagecoach, a desert storm, a cowboy who had promised to get her to Carson City safely and had instead guided her home to his heart. "What are you thinking?" Kyle murmured against her hair. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," Katherine replied, nestling closer to her husband. "That sometimes the journey itself is the destination." Kyle's arms tightened around her. "Then I'm glad your stagecoach broke down, schoolteacher." "So am I, cowboy," Katherine whispered. "So am I." Spring came to Nevada, bringing wildflowers to the desert and new calves to the silver dollar. Katherine continued teaching in Carson City, making the daily journey in her buggy, or sometimes on horseback when weather permitted. The town had largely accepted her marriage, particularly as they observed Kyle's respectful attendance at school functions and Katherine's evident happiness. Frank Reynolds' health declined further as summer approached. By July, he was bedridden, with doctors visiting regularly from Carson City. Katherine and Kyle moved temporarily into the main house to be closer to him during his final days. On a warm August evening with golden light streaming through the bedroom windows, Frank called them both to his side. His voice was weak but his mind clear as he clasped their hands together in his frail ones. "Done right by this ranch," he told Kyle. "Better than my own son could have." "Proud of you, boy." "I know, Frank," Kyle said gently. "Rest now." "And you," Frank said to Katherine, his roomy eyes still sharp. "Best thing ever happened to this place, to him." He squeezed their joined hands. "Take care of each other and the silver dollar." "We will," Katherine promised. "You have our word." Frank nodded, seemingly satisfied. He died peacefully in his sleep that night, Katherine reading Tennyson aloud while Kyle sat vigil beside the old man who had been more father than employer to him. The funeral brought people from across the territory, ranchers, politicians, old friends, even Frank's son from Boston, who seemed genuinely moved by the outpouring of respect for his father. Katherine stood beside Kyle throughout, her quiet strength supporting him as he delivered a eulogy that left few dry eyes in the gathering. Afterward, as they walked together through the Silver Dollar's north pasture, where Frank had asked to be buried, overlooking the ranch he'd built, Kyle finally allowed himself to fully grieve. Katherine held him as silent tears tracked down his weathered face, her own grief mingling with his. "He changed my life," Kyle said eventually, looking out over the ranch that was now officially his to manage, with a portion of ownership shared with Frank's son. "Gave me purpose when I had none, a home when I was adrift." "He saw the man you truly are," Katherine replied. "Just as I do." Kyle turned to her, his expression softening. "You know, I've been so focused on Frank these past weeks that I haven't properly thanked you." "For what?" "For standing by me, for making this place truly home, for believing in me when others didn't." He touched her cheek gently. "For being my wife." Katherine smiled, covering his hand with hers. "I have news," she said. "News I've been waiting to share until after." She gestured toward the fresh grave. "I'm with child, Kyle, due in February." Kyle stared at her, momentarily speechless. Then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. "A baby. We're having a baby," Katherine nodded, laughing as Kyle suddenly lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle of pure joy. "Careful," she protested, though she was laughing too. "I'm in a delicate condition, remember." Kyle set her down immediately but kept his arms around her. "A baby," he repeated in wonder. "Frank knew, didn't he? That's why he said that bit about taking care of each other." "I told him last week," Katherine admitted. "I hope you don't mind. He was so happy," Kyle said. "It was the best news he could have had." Kyle looked toward the grave, then back at his wife. "Life goes on," he said softly. Frank understood that better than most. "It does," Katherine agreed. "And our family is just beginning." Their son, Franklin Kyle Hawkins, was born on a snowy February morning in 1870. Katherine had planned to deliver in Carson City with the town doctor, but an early snowstorm made travel impossible. Instead, she gave birth at the Silver Dollar, attended by Mrs. Navarro and a midwife from the Paiute Reservation. Kyle paced outside the bedroom door for hours, his fear gradually giving way to awe when Mrs. Navarro finally let him in to see his wife and newborn son. The baby was sturdy and strong-lunged, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue as his father's. "He's perfect," Kyle whispered, carefully taking the swaddled infant from Katherine. "You're perfect, both of you." Katherine watched her husband cradle their son, overwhelmed by love for both of them. The journey that had begun with a broken stagecoach in the desert had led here to family, to home, to a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. Spring brought Katherine's return to teaching. With baby Franklin often accompanying her to school in a special cradle Kyle had built that fit in her buggy. Her students were enchanted by the infant, and the school board found they couldn't object to the arrangement when several prominent town mothers expressed their approval of Katherine's dedication to both her child and her pupils. As Franklin grew from infant to toddler, life settled into satisfying patterns. Katherine taught during the week, while Kyle managed the increasingly prosperous Silver Dollar. Weekends found them together at the ranch, building the life and family they both cherished. When Franklin was 2, Katherine set aside teaching temporarily to welcome their daughter, Margaret Rose. Unlike her brother's dramatic arrival during a snowstorm, Maggie was born on a perfect spring day with the desert blooming outside the window. By the time Katherine returned to the classroom the following year, Carson City had grown significantly. The school had expanded to include a second teacher for the younger children, allowing Katherine to focus on the older students and develop a more advanced curriculum. The railroad had reached the town, bringing new residents, businesses, and opportunities. Through it all, the Silver Dollar remained a constant, expanding its operations under Kyle's management, becoming known throughout the territory for its progressive ranching practices and quality livestock. The Wheeler family, their animosity gradually softened by time and by Franklin's friendship with young Wheeler grandchildren, eventually reached a state of civil coexistence with the Hawkins family. And each year, on the anniversary of the day Katherine's stagecoach had broken down in the desert, she and Kyle would ride out alone to a small cabin they'd built near the spot where they'd first met. There they would spend a night reminiscing about the storm that had thrown them together, the challenges they'd overcome, and the life they continued to build together. "You ever regret it?" Kyle asked on one such anniversary as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Leaving Philadelphia, breaking down in the desert, marrying a cowboy with a complicated past. Katherine leaned against her husband's shoulder, thinking of their children sleeping peacefully back at the ranch house under Mrs. Navarro's watchful eye, of the school where generations of Carson City children now received education, of the Silver Dollar thriving under their joint stewardship, of the love that had only deepened with each passing year. "Not for a single moment," she replied, turning her face up to his. "My stagecoach breaking down was the luckiest accident of my life." Kyle smiled, that same smile that had first revealed the dimple in his cheek and the warmth in his eyes all those years ago. "And my promise to get you safely to Carson City, you kept it," Katherine said softly, "in ways neither of us could have imagined." As twilight descended over the Nevada desert, Kyle Hawkins kissed his wife with the same tenderness he'd shown on their wedding day, both of them secure in the knowledge that their journey, begun in uncertainty and danger, had led them exactly where they were meant to be: home, in each other's arms.